So the best place to start with diabetes is we need to understand what it is. We need to understand what is diabetes, what does that mean, and kind of how long have we been aware of diabetes as a disease, okay? So the official name is diabetes mellitus, okay? And so from Greek, diabetes stands for to pass through or to siphon. And then Latin, mellitus means sweet or honey-like, okay? And so this name came from the fact that one of the primary ways of diagnosing a person as being a diabetic in the olden days was that when we would taste people's urine, it had a sweet taste, okay? You know, you guys go and you want to be interns or you want to get some shadowing hours and you go to a doctor's office and do things. Now, well, back in the olden days, like in the 15 and 16 and 1700s, and even into the early 1900s, the primary way of diagnosing a person as being diabetic was that someone had to drink and taste their urine. And if their urine tasted sweet because it had a lot of glucose in it, it had way more glucose in the urine than normal, then that's how we would diagnose the person as being diabetic, okay? So if you think that you get bad jobs being an intern now, just be happy that you weren't the urine taster, okay? So life could be a little bit worse, but that's how we did this. And we'll talk about kind of why you're gonna end up with more glucose in your urine as a primary symptom, okay? Okay, so in the present day, okay, so diabetes represents a cluster of a couple of different metabolic conditions. Okay, so diabetes is a metabolic disorder. And it's a metabolic disorder as it relates to specifically carbohydrate and glucose metabolism. Okay, it is really going to get at and impair the ability of your cells to take in glucose, okay, and respond to insulin correctly. And you're not going to be able to do that, and so there's going to be some consequences that are going to be associated. You're going to have a difficult time having some energy because you cannot get the glucose into your cells to break it down, okay? Plus you're going to have chronically high levels of glucose in your blood, and that can cause some problems in your kidneys and in your blood vessels and things because we have to try to filter that extra glucose out, okay? Okay, so the primary symptom of a person who is diabetic is elevated levels of glucose in their blood, okay? So the easiest way for us to test this is just very simply to do a finger stick, take a drop of your blood, all right? Do this first thing in the morning when you haven't had anything to eat yet, and then see how much glucose is going to be in your blood. And there are these normal ranges of, if you've been fasting for a certain number of hours, of about where it should be, okay? Trying to pull up the chat and see what's happening in, oh, Gia can't find the lecture slides. That's probably because I haven't posted the lecture slides yet, have I? Okay, so that's a bit of a problem. Would you guys like for me to pause and at least put the PowerPoint up, or do you want me to just wait, and then when we take our break, I can go grab my my tablet and I can actually do the PDF of it then? Do y'all have a preference? Gia, yes, you'd like some form of the slides now? Okay.
Yeah, I'm really lost. I couldn't find it, so I spent like most of the when you were talking trying to look for it.
Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing really quickly. I'm going to our recording again, back to screen sharing, and we will move ourselves forward, okay? So the thing to appreciate about diabetes and the thing to appreciate about glucose metabolism is that the body likes to maintain homeostasis, okay? And so it wants to hold the levels of certain things in your blood in a very, very narrow range, if at all possible, at all times, okay? And there's a host of reasons why that's good and why that needs to happen. But for the purposes of this class, we just need to know that it wants to keep it in this narrow range. So blood glucose tends to be relatively tightly regulated by the body at all times, okay? It needs to be at a certain level. It needs to be high enough so that the brain and the heart always have glucose, okay? But we also don't want it to get so high and remain super duper high, because that can also lead to some bad things. So in order to know what's wrong with you if you have diabetes, we need to understand what's the normal response when you consume glucose, okay? So I'm drinking, it's Mountain Dew Zero Sugar, but if I'd had a regular Mountain Dew, I looked at the amount of carbs yesterday that were in. We have some orange pineapple juice, and my wife, we were trying to get our daughter to not just drink milk all the time because it fills her up and then she doesn't want to eat at the meals. She hates water. She's a little girl after my own heart. I think water is dumb. It tastes like nothing, and that makes me sad. Anyway, but I was like, oh, we'll just give her some juice. That'll be okay. My wife said, do you know like how much sugar is in the juice and those kinds of things? She's like never had juice in her life. We've tried not to. And I'm like, there can't be that much more sugar in the juice than there is in milk. And then I went and looked, and there was like 5 times more. Like there were like 30 grams of carbs in 8 ounces of this juice, and there were 6 grams of carbs in whole milk that we'd been giving her on all of that. And I said, okay, for once my wife was right about these things. But my point was, if this was a regular Mountain Dew or it was a cup of orange juice or something, and I drink it, within maybe 20 or 30 minutes, that's going to get into my stomach, okay? And then I'm going to move it from my stomach into my small intestine, and I'm going to absorb the glucose. We're going to break it down into its constituent glucose molecules. It's going to then get absorbed in the small intestine, and whatever glucose you're eating eventually will end up in your bloodstream. And so when I do that, you can track this increase in my blood glucose in a very predictable manner following a meal, following the ingestion of anything that has glucose in it. Now, if you eat something that has fat or protein, the same thing happens. It gets broken down, and you can see this kind of delayed increase in the next half an hour to an hour afterwards of things being absorbed into your blood. Okay. Under normal circumstances, blood glucose increases, right? When it increases, there are specialized cells that are going to be located in your pancreas, okay? And these are what are called the beta cells, and they're located in the islets of Langerhans. And this is all on a slide that we'll kind of breeze through in the next couple. But these cells produce a hormone that is called insulin, okay? So you eat a meal, it has glucose in it, your blood glucose goes up, the pancreas then is going to be signaled to release insulin, okay? That insulin is released into your blood. It gets circulated around throughout your body, and you have certain tissues in your body, particularly skeletal muscle and adipose tissue, that have receptors for insulin on them. And when insulin binds to its receptor on skeletal muscle, then that's going to tell the muscle to try to suck some glucose out of the blood and pull it into the muscle, okay? And then it can do things with it in the muscle. It can break it down for ATP, or maybe it can store it in the muscle as glycogen, okay, which is a glucose or a carbohydrate storage molecule. Additionally, you get some insulin release. Insulin can bind to receptors on adipose tissue, and what will happen then is it's going to pull some of that glucose into the adipose tissue, and then through some more complicated processes, it will then convert that glucose into fat, okay? If I'm a diabetic, there's going to be one of 2 things that are going to be wrong with me that are going to prevent that normal response from happening, okay? If I am a type 1 diabetic, I will be what is called insulin deficient, okay? You eat something, your blood glucose goes up, your pancreas does not make any insulin. Therefore, it cannot respond properly when your blood glucose goes up. Okay? So, no insulin. So, there's no signal to your muscles or there's no signal to adipose tissue to remove the glucose from your bloodstream. Therefore, your blood sugar will stay elevated for a prolonged period of time. Now, eventually, one of the ways that you can clear this extra glucose out of your blood is it gets filtered at the kidneys, and then it's going to leave your body in your urine. That's why you can diagnose, or they tried to diagnose people as being diabetic by tasting their urine. You have an excess amount of glucose in your urine because you don't make any insulin, so you can't drive it into any other tissues, and so it stays elevated. It's going to get filtered at the kidneys. Okay? That's if you're a type 1 diabetic. Okay? If you are a type 2 diabetic, then you are what we call insulin resistant. So type 2 diabetics, and this is the most common form of diabetes. This is like 99% of all diabetics are type 2. Okay? Then your pancreas functions just fine. You make plenty of insulin. Okay? But your blood glucose goes up, you release insulin, but the tissue, so skeletal muscle especially, does not respond properly to the insulin. And so what happens because of that then is that you're not going to drive any glucose into muscle. You're not going to drive as much into adipose. The adipose tissue receptors seem to work fine. So you're going to get more going into adipose tissue than you're going to get going into the muscle. And so eventually then what happens is my blood glucose stays elevated, so my pancreas has to make more and more and more and more insulin. And eventually it will get some into the muscles, and some will get filtered at the kidneys, and a bunch will go into skeletal muscle. Okay? So if I'm a type 1 diabetic, I make no insulin. If I'm a type 2 diabetic, then especially my muscles do not respond correctly to insulin. The end product, okay, of this is that whether I'm type 1 or type 2, I have a difficult time moving glucose that I have eaten out of my blood and into normal tissues, into skeletal muscle. And so when you test my blood glucose levels, whether I'm type 1 or type 2, I'm going to have these noticeably higher blood glucose levels. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? We're going to go into a little bit more detail of what is the signaling pathway, how does it work. We don't fully understand how and why it gets impaired, but that's what's going on. Okay? Any questions? Everybody with me? Blink your things at me or give me a thumbs up or, give me something today, guys. Okay.
Is the glucose and the insulin going to the adipose tissue and muscle tissue, or is it just one of them?
Both. Adipose tissue, Lindsay, and muscle have receptors for insulin. So the insulin just gets in your blood, and as it circulates around, if a tissue has a receptor for it, then it can bind on that tissue, and then it tells that tissue to do something. Okay, so you've got glucose in the blood, insulin in the blood. Certain tissues respond to the insulin, and then they will do something with the glucose. Other tissues that don't have insulin receptors won't do anything with the glucose. Okay. So a couple of additional pieces of information about type 1 and type 2. So traditionally, type 1 diabetes has been called juvenile onset diabetes. So type 1 diabetes mostly results from what's called an autoimmune disorder. And so if you're a type 1 diabetic, at some point, typically when you are, an adolescent or into your teenage years, your immune system will attack the beta cells in the pancreas and destroy them. We don't fully understand why that happens. There does seem to be some genetic component to it, but your immune system attacks those cells, it destroys the beta cells, and so the pancreas then loses its ability to produce insulin. Okay? 100 years ago, type 1 diabetes was the primary type of diabetes. It is no longer the case. Okay? Generally, if you're going to be a type 1 diabetic, most people that are going to have this happen, it will occur by the time they're in their late teenage years. Occasionally, you will see people maybe in their mid to late 20s, maybe somebody into their 30s, but generally, if you're going to be a type 1 diabetic, it will come on when you're an adolescent or a teenager. Okay? So that's type 1. Type 2 has traditionally been called adult onset diabetes. Okay? And 100 years ago, even in some ways 30, 40, 50 years ago, type 2 diabetes was much, much less prevalent than it is today. It's called adult onset because in some ways, like cardiovascular disease, it seemed to be a progressive disorder that would occur once people got into their 50s or 60s or 70s. Okay? And so these people still made insulin, their beta cells still function properly. Just something happened in their muscles, especially where the insulin did not bind to its receptors correctly. And so they look like a type 1 diabetic, but kind of what's wrong with them on the cellular level is a little bit different. We used to call it adult onset, and it is primarily still adult onset, okay? But the age at which a lot of people are becoming type 2 diabetics is getting lower and lower and lower. We see teenagers now that are type 2 diabetics. That was unheard of 20, 30 years ago, okay? We see people in their 20s that are type 2 diabetic. Unheard of, okay, 30 and 40 years ago. And so the age at which this is going to occur is getting to be younger and younger and younger. And that's very, very alarming, because if you become a type 2 diabetic, there's a lot of really nasty kind of consequences as it relates to vision and kidney function and liver function and things. And so the longer that you have it, then the greater your chances of developing some of these kind of secondary consequences. Okay? All right, so what's a risk factor? We talked about all of these risk factors for developing cardiovascular disease. Well, what's going to put you at risk for developing diabetes? So the only real risk factor for being a type 1 diabetic is genetics, okay? So if you have someone else in your immediate family that is a type 1 diabetic, you're at an increased risk, okay? As we said, it's immune mediated, it's an autoimmune disorder, although strangely, people that are type 1 diabetics don't seem to have a lot of other autoimmune disorders. Like my mom has like 5 different autoimmune disorders. Her immune system hates her, right? She has rheumatoid arthritis, which we will talk about next week. She has kind of a mild form of, they keep thinking that it's lupus, but it's really not lupus, and a couple of other things where for whatever reason, her immune system just seems to want to attack her normal cells. That seems to kind of cluster. If you have rheumatoid arthritis, you tend to have some other immune-mediated things, but diabetes doesn't seem to be that way. So if you have a relative that's a type 1 diabetic, you're going to be at an increased risk, okay? If we look at the risk factors for becoming a type 2 diabetic, they look an awful lot like the risk factors for developing cardiovascular disease. We'll talk about why in a minute, okay? But there is a large genetic component, also in type 2. If you have one of your parents that is a type 2 diabetic, you have twice the risk of becoming one as a person that does not have a parent that's a type 2 diabetic, okay? Being obese is probably the single largest risk factor for becoming a type 2 diabetic as well. And so a lot of the hereditary stuff for development is likely related to the heredity behind obesity, okay? So about 80% of people that become type 2 diabetics are overweight or obese by BMI at onset, okay? So having excess body fat is going to be one of the key drivers of what we call insulin resistance. We don't fully understand what it is about having excess body fat that is going to make your insulin receptors stop functioning correctly in skeletal muscle, but that is one of the most common things that we see across all of the research. Okay. Being older, so over the age of 45, type 2 diabetes is a progressively developing disorder, much like a lot of cardiovascular disease. But a lot of that may be related to the progressive development of obesity and the progressive development of a sedentary lifestyle. Okay, so people that are sedentary are more at risk. Now, how much of that is, again, driven by this kind of chicken or the egg of sedentary behaviors and obesity? I've become more sedentary, and now I have also become more obese. Which one is driving a lot of this? In some ways, it doesn't matter. But we do see that people that, even if they are obese, that are not sedentary, tend to have much, much, much lower rates of type 2 diabetes. Okay, so there is something about this interaction between having excess body fat and also being sedentary that are going to drive the development of type 2 diabetes. Okay, the other two risk factors are just the same kind of ones as cardiovascular disease. So having high blood pressure. Okay, again, that seems to be related to obesity and being sedentary and being dyslipidemic, so having high levels of cholesterol. Okay, so you guys can probably imagine that if these are the risk factors for becoming a type 2 diabetic, almost all of these are also risk factors for development of cardiovascular disease, especially coronary artery disease. And so generally, not 100% of the time, but in most people, if you get to the place where you are a type 2 diabetic, you're also going to have cardiovascular disease. You're probably also going to have coronary artery disease. And so most people that are diabetic, it's not the diabetes that ends up killing them. It's not the improper function of insulin or their glucose metabolism. Most people that are type 2 diabetic will die of cardiovascular disease. They'll die of a heart attack or congestive heart failure or something like that. Okay, so in a lot of ways, it's very difficult for us to uncouple this clustering of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease together. Okay, okay, that clustering has a name, and we call it metabolic syndrome, or it used to be called metabolic syndrome X, because they would notice that these things would kind of all occur together in people. But now we just call it metabolic syndrome. But you are type 2 diabetic, you have high blood pressure, you are obese, and you have high LDL cholesterol. And so this idea of metabolic syndrome, okay, this is arguably, this is the greatest public health burden that we have going forward in the next 50 years. Okay, so this is the thing that's going to lead to a huge number of deaths due to cardiovascular disease, but it also leads to these huge, dramatically huge healthcare costs, because you can be a type 2 diabetic and you can have these things and you can live for a very, very long time, but the cost of caring for you is astronomical. Okay. Okay. So we talked a little bit about this idea of insulin resistance. Okay. So almost 10% of the world's population, we think, has type 2 diabetes. A lot of it is undiagnosed. Okay. Now, it's probably very unlikely that any of you guys are type 2 diabetics, although there's a chance that we may have one or two of you guys that are going to fall in this category of what we'd call pre-diabetes. Okay. And a lot of that would probably at this point in your life be related to blood pressure, family history, and maybe being sedentary. So we could probably find some people on OU's campus that are college age that are type 2 diabetics. Okay, but about 10% of the world population. The vast majority of that 10% are in what we think of as developed Western nations. Okay, so the US, Canada, Japan, the more developed portions of China, okay, the kind of more urban areas in China, and then India, the more developed places in India, and then most of Russia and all of Europe, okay? Brazil is getting a little bit more to kind of be that, but a lot of it is in those places. You don't see a huge amount of it in, say, sub-Saharan Africa. You don't see it in places where, by the nature of their jobs, people are much more active and they have less access to kind of fast food and those things. Okay. The rates of this have exploded in the last 30 years. Okay, they've just exploded. And so we think that the rate in the US may double in, say, the next kind of 20 to 30 years again. It's doubled in the last 30, and we think it may double again. Okay, so we're kind of working our way through kind of what all of these things, right? So how do we treat you if you have all of this? We've kind of given you the scary numbers. Here's what's wrong with you. How do we treat you? Okay, so there were some interesting things, all right? And so this is some history that I was not fully aware of until Dr. Pinku talked to me about this to some extent, okay? So one of the things and one of the ways that we treat being a type 1 diabetic is we need to give you insulin. If your body doesn't make insulin, then we need to give you insulin, okay? So what you can see here in our pictures on the left is this gentleman's name was Ted Ryder, okay? And you can see him in 1922 in this picture, and then in 1923 after he began taking insulin. So what you can notice from here is you see how skinny he is. So one of the things in people that are type 1 diabetics, kind of one of the hallmarks is they have a difficult time gaining weight because they cannot drive glucose into their cells. And so they have a hard time, adding tissue. They can't get enough energy to continue to grow and do things, okay? And so what happened was Ted was the first person to receive insulin. And so the guys that you see on the right there with this dog, the dog's name was Marjorie. That was her name. But this is some gentleman named Bantine and Best, and they extracted insulin, okay, from this dog, from insulin from a dog, and they gave the insulin to Ted. And what they found was that when they gave him the insulin, then magically it was able to work and bind to the human insulin receptor. With this insulin, he was able to properly metabolize glucose with some level of monitoring. And so you can see then that he was able to clearly put on some weight and look much more like what you would expect, say, we could figure out how old he was in those pictures, but, maybe 6 or 7 years old, okay? So initially, the first way that we were wanting to treat type 1 diabetics was with insulin from other animals, okay? But the idea is still the same today. We give people, if you're a type 1 diabetic, you need insulin. So Dr. Pinku, he has an insulin pump that is always attached to him. And so when he eats something, it monitors his blood glucose levels. And when his blood glucose begins to rise, then the pump will inject some insulin into him. And it helps to kind of even out these things, okay? So that's how we tend to treat type 1 diabetes, is we're gonna give people insulin. That comes with its own issues now. So a lot of you know people that look like that were type 1 diabetics, okay? Purchasing insulin, especially if you don't have health insurance right now, is astronomically expensive, okay? It's probably $700 or $800 for a month's supply of insulin. This is a drug, or a drug in some ways. You get it from a drug company, but without your insulin, people that are type 1 diabetics will die. They will not die like in a month potentially, but they will die. And I'm trying to remember, I should have looked. I looked up the name of the drug company. I don't think it's Glaxo. It may be Merck or one of them, but they have the patent for the recombinant insulin in the U.S. and they can charge whatever they want for it, basically. And they have the price of insulin has gone up a huge amount in the last, say, 15 or 20 years. And so, because they know that people need the drug and they'll pay whatever they have to pay for it. So if you have insurance, the insurance will pay for it, and that's good. It's widely covered, but it's really, really, really expensive. And so, if you work in a job where you can't get insurance and you have a hard time being able to get your own insurance and you're going to try to buy this out of pocket, it's really, really expensive. And so just keep all of these things in mind. We need some level of kind of drug price reform, especially as it relates to insulin, because people shouldn't be able to kind of hold you monetarily hostage, in my mind, just to be able to keep you alive. Okay. So that's how we treat type 1 diabetes. You eat something, your blood glucose goes up, you inject yourself with insulin either through a pump, or you just stick yourself and you give yourself some, and then that insulin functions and your tissues respond properly, your blood glucose goes back down, and we're good to go. Okay? But let's say you're a type 1 diabetic and you're not getting insulin. Or let's say you're a type 2 diabetic and you're not managing things via diet and some physical activity, which we'll talk about in a few slides, and you have these chronically elevated levels of blood glucose. Okay, we call this condition hyperglycemia. You're hyperglycemic. Hyper means high, elevated. Okay, if you have uncontrolled diabetes, be it type 1 or type 2, you're going to have this chronic hyperglycemic state. You have these elevated blood glucose levels all the time. This is going to result in damage to small blood vessels. Because of the blood vessel damage, it's going to result in damage to nerves, okay? And it may also result in damage to your kidneys. So chronic complications of diabetes are going to be cardiovascular disease, okay? Typically because these people are also obese and have high LDL cholesterol levels, they're going to develop atherosclerosis, and so we see a lot of coronary artery disease in them. We see a lot of high blood pressure in them. We see a lot of strokes in those people. But they get a lot of kidney damage, okay? Diabetes is the leading cause of adult onset blindness, okay? And it's the leading cause of kind of traumatic amputations. So what happens is these chronically high levels of blood glucose cause damage in small blood vessels, in capillaries and things in the periphery and in your eyes. And so being hyperglycemic, those blood vessels get damaged, so they can't supply blood to the nerves. And so you get nerve damage in the eyes. We call that a diabetic retinopathy. Nerve damage kind of ends with this apathy. So you get retinopathy, which is nerve damage in the eyes. You get a diabetic nephropathy, which is the nerves that go to the kidneys. And so you're going to get damage in the kidneys, okay? Damage in the nephrons, because it has to filter all of this glucose, okay? And you can also get what we call peripheral neuropathies, which is just nerve damage in your hands and especially in your feet. And this nerve damage can be from a lack of blood flow, so you can get some tissue damage from lack of blood flow. But if you get these neuropathies, what happens with these nerves is that the nerves become damaged and they just randomly fire. And it seems to affect nerves that are going to be type 3 and type 4 afferent nerve fibers, which are the things that give you the sense of touch, okay, and a sense of pain, right? So they're going to be ways that you sense, what does this feel like? So when that goes, you get numbness, okay? You cannot feel sensation there. And then you also get what is described as one of the single most painful kinds of things. You get this very sharp, shooting, burning pain, okay, in your peripheral limbs, in your hands and in your feet especially. And there's basically no treatment for it because you have nerve damage. One of the things that they can do is they can do an amputation. They can take things off, or they can try to go in and like more fully kind of clip off and kill off the nerves to prevent the pain, but then that causes some other further damage, okay? So when I told you guys that there are these really, really severe, really nasty complications to diabetes, these are the things that I'm talking about, okay? These are the things that I mean. Okay, so if I'm a type 2 diabetic, how do I treat myself? What are going to be the best treatments for me? Well, there can be a host of things that we can try to do. And once you're first diagnosed as a type 2 diabetic, if it's not too severe, they will generally try to treat you with some alterations in your diet and alterations in physical activity. We'll talk about kind of how and why that works in just a minute, okay? But the most common forms of dietary changes are going to be, one, to cut back on your total caloric intake, to try to not eat excessive amounts of food. And then they may also suggest to you that you lower the percentage of your caloric intake that is coming from carbohydrates, okay? Especially from simple sugar, which you guys might think of as processed or refined sugar, okay? So no candy. Boy, do I love a bag of Starburst jelly beans, okay? But I get a bag and I'm going to eat the whole bag in one day. There's just no getting around it. But that's the kind of changes in diet. So people that want to go on a little bit more of a lower carbohydrate, higher fat, higher protein diet, more of a ketogenic diet, more of an Atkins or kind of the South Beach diet things, those can have some real benefits, okay? And because you don't eat as many carbohydrates, then your inability to drive some of those carbohydrates and the chronic kind of high elevations of blood glucose and the corresponding kind of high production of insulin is going to be evened out a little bit, okay? So now there may be some other kind of longer term complications to eating high levels of fat, especially over time. We don't think chronic protein intake is that bad, doesn't really cause kidney damage or anything. We don't really know enough about the high fat content yet, okay? But we can do some things with diet. And then we prescribe physical activity, things as simple as seriously go for a walk, okay? And for a lot of people that are early on with type 2 diabetes, if you can make more permanent changes in your diet and you can become physically active, then we can treat your diabetes in this way, okay? We may not be able to fully reverse what's going on, but we can do a really good job of being able to treat it, and it will prevent some of the progression towards some of these really bad secondary complications, and you will not necessarily have to take medication, okay? So now I should also mention that one of the best ways to prevent type 2 diabetes from developing is also to kind of look at some of your diet things and not eat excessively, which is really hard for me, but also to be physically active. People that are physically active have just you're not going to never become a type 2 diabetic, but if you're a regular exerciser, like if you're jogging or riding a bike or doing elliptical 3 or 4 times a week for a half an hour, then it's going to be not impossible, but it's going to be really, 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 you're going to have to really excessively overeat to kind of have really increased rates of type 2 diabetes, okay? Now, let's say your type 2 diabetes is more severe, or let's say you're a person like most Americans that has some trouble, okay, adhering to the prescribed diet, or you have trouble getting the necessary physical activity, which, to be honest, as the disease progresses and you get nerve damage and things and you have blood flow issues and it becomes more and more difficult for you to exercise, then taking medications are going to maybe become the best bet, okay? So some of the things that we have people take, they're called oral anti-hyperglycemic agents, okay? So we can do a couple of things. One of them is called, they're called secretagogues, which I always have a hard time pronouncing, but secretagogues or something like that. And they induce insulin secretion. And so this is not always a problem in people that are type 2 diabetics, but sometimes you can give people this, and if they take it in between meals, then it may kind of help them to drive things down a little bit further. But the most common types are going to be, the most common type of drug that's prescribed is something called metformin. and it is an insulin sensitizer. And so you take the drug, and that drug rescues the function of the insulin receptors, especially on skeletal muscle. And so it's going to allow those receptors to bind more insulin. It's going to allow those receptors to function much more like a regular non-type 2 diabetic. Okay. Those drugs also decrease hepatic glucose production. One of the other things that happens is your liver, if you eat a bunch of fat and a bunch of protein, your liver will convert some of that stuff through a process called gluconeogenesis in the liver into glucose because the brain needs glucose. And you can take some agents that will reduce some of that, and so that helps to kind of not get this additional kind of blood glucose stuff. But the big thing that they do is they are going to make your insulin receptors function much more like normal. Okay. These drugs, if we look at that erectile dysfunction and then drugs that lower cholesterol, are usually like 3 of the top 5 most widely prescribed drugs in the US. Then metformin and these kind of insulin sensitizers are going to be the other drugs that are in the top 5. Okay, these are some of the most widely prescribed ones. We can also give people things that will modulate digestion. And what they're doing is they're attempting to inhibit or reduce glucose absorption in the small intestine. Okay, so you take a pill and then you eat a normal meal, and what happens is you're just going to poop out extra glucose because you're not going to be able to absorb that in the small intestine. Okay, so the problem with those is there may be some side effects from all of that. There may be some GI distress due to all of those kinds of things. We also have drugs that will prevent fat absorption. They also will sometimes make foods. They used to make potato chips with a weirdly modified form of fat in it that could not be absorbed. They were made with stuff called olein, and you would eat it and it couldn't get absorbed in the small intestine, and so it would but the problem is it would speed everything moving through your digestive system, and so it would give people diarrhea a lot. But you could eat the chips, and they were lower calorie and lower in saturated fat than regular chips. But they do make drugs that will do all of these kinds of things. Okay, the primary medication for a type 1 diabetic is going to be an insulin and an insulin pump. And so here's what the pumps are going to look like. And so Dr. Pinku has a pump that's pretty much standard of care. If you have insurance, then the pumps are really good because you don't ever have to think about anything more than putting your insulin into the pump. And the pump monitors your blood glucose, and it will release the correct dose of insulin at the correct time as your blood glucose levels change. If you don't have a pump, then you eat a meal, you got to wait a little while, you got to prick your finger, you got to measure your glucose levels and then see where they are, and then inject yourself with a certain dose of insulin, and then wait a little while and check your glucose levels again. So the big issues with people that are type 1 diabetics, the thing that we really worry about in them is that they will, especially if they're taking insulin, they may take too much insulin, or then they're going to get to a place, especially like in the mornings after they have fasted for a while, that they will have very, very low blood sugar levels. They will become hypoglycemic, and then they'll pass out, or they will faint, and they can go into a coma, and it can be really, really, really dangerous. They got to make sure their insulin dose is correct. Okay, so we talked about a lot of these different kinds of things. And so when you are hyperglycemic and you're not driving enough glucose into your cells, then the body needs some additional energy. For most people, you've not probably eaten enough fat and not eaten enough protein to adequately kind of do things. And so what happens is a process called ketoacidosis. And ketoacidosis is where you're going to create these ketone bodies. You're going to basically convert protein into these ketone bodies, or fat into these, I think it's mostly protein, into these ketone bodies, and they're going to get in, and then they can get converted into glucose in your cells, and you can do some things that way. And so people that are in a state of ketoacidosis, their breath smells really fruity. So if you have any friends that are like super big ketogenic diet people, or maybe they are fitness models or want to do fitness competitions or bodybuilders or something. They will very oftentimes like eat very low carbs and like just eat chicken all the time, like plain boiled chicken. And if you do that, you don't take in carbs, you will eventually go into ketoacidosis, and you will have this kind of weird fruity smelling breath. There was a guy that was a graduate student when I was a graduate student at the University of Georgia, and he did like bodybuilding competitions, and when he was getting close, he would just eat chicken all the time, and so we would give him grief about his fruity smelling breath. Okay. So if you become hypoglycemic, which very often is if you don't match your insulin dose correctly, hypoglycemia is not really something we got to worry about in a type 2 diabetic. But if you have a type 1 diabetic and they give themselves too much insulin, or as you guys will see in the next few slides, there's something really interesting about exercise and physical activity that also drives glucose into your cells. So you have a diabetic person, type 1 diabetic, they've taken some insulin and then they go for a run. They may actually end up in a place where they draw too much glucose into their cells. Okay. And if you become hypoglycemic, then you can lose consciousness. You can kind of present with confusion, okay, weakness, impaired vision, and if it's bad enough, then people can become unresponsive and go into a coma. So my second year at OU, I had a girl in class. We had class at 8 o'clock in the morning. Over in columns, I had a girl in class who was a type 1 diabetic, and she did not have an insulin pump. And she warned me on the first day of class that she was not very good about eating breakfast and doing things, and that her diabetes was not always particularly well controlled. And she said, if I pass out in class, then obviously call 911, but I always I should normally have like a candy bar or something or a bottle of juice or something in my bag, shove it in my mouth and try to get me, to get my blood glucose levels back up. And so if you don't take things very seriously when you're a type 1 diabetic, it's not that difficult to become hypoglycemic. Okay. So if you have friends that are type 1 diabetics, then you need to always kind of keep an eye on them. And if y'all are going where you're going hiking or doing any kind of physical activity, you always want to, if you're with them, to have some kind of a sugary drink, or a Snickers bar or something along the way, because it's really going to be better for them to make sure they're consuming adequate amounts of carbohydrates. Okay. So we've talked about insulin function. What I want to show you guys, though, is how insulin works in skeletal muscle. Okay. So you eat carbohydrates. They get absorbed in the small intestine. Your blood glucose levels rise. That's going to trigger the pancreas, the beta cells, and the islets of Langerhans to make insulin. That insulin then gets into your bloodstream. Okay. It's going to circulate around throughout your body. It's going to get down into the capillaries, and there's going to be those capillaries that are going to run right next to skeletal muscle. Okay. On the exterior of skeletal muscle are these, what we call insulin receptors. Okay. When the insulin floats past its insulin receptor, it has an affinity they have an affinity for each other, and the insulin may bind to its receptor. When that happens, okay, it is going to activate this receptor, and there's going to be some signals that will then happen on the inside of this muscle cell. Okay, so I still have glucose in my bloodstream. So this is a capillary out here. This is the surface of my skeletal muscle. Insulin will bind to its receptor. Okay, that sends a signal that is reasonably complicated. Okay, through a bunch of something we call a signaling cascade, involving what are often termed second messengers. But some things happen. We phosphorylate some things on the bottom of this receptor. It activates some things. It signals through something called AMP kinase and does a bunch of stuff. There's like 30 different steps. But eventually what happens is insulin binds. Inside of your muscle cells, you have these little storage molecules called vesicles. And inside these vesicles are a receptor called GLUT4. Okay? GLUT4 wants to grab glucose and bring it into muscle cells. It brings it into any tissue. Any tissue that expresses GLUT4 in its surface membrane will grab glucose out of the capillaries that are running by that particular tissue. So insulin binds, signaling cascade. That's going to eventually then tell these vesicles that are containing GLUT4, hey, we got an insulin binding. Now go move to the surface of that muscle cell, move to the sarcolemma, okay, and stick these GLUT4 molecules into the membrane, right? So here's our GLUT4 molecules. They're going to get integrated and stuck into the membrane, okay? Once they are in the membrane, they will then bind a glucose molecule that's floating by in the blood in the capillaries, okay? They pull that glucose molecule then down into the inside of that muscle cell. And then once that has happened, then eventually these GLUT4 molecules are going to get sucked back up into a vesicle and recycled back down and go back and hang out again on the inside of the cell and wait for the next signal coming from insulin to tell them to move up. Okay? So this is the easy way of looking at this pathway. You eat and consume glucose. That tells insulin to get released. Insulin comes out, binds to its receptor. That tells GLUT4 to go and bind in the membrane. We pull glucose into the cell. Okay? So now we have done two things. We've now lowered our blood glucose levels, and we have now raised the amount of glucose that is floating around inside this muscle cell. So I can then break that glucose molecule down, okay, and make energy from it, or I can take it and hook it together with other glucose molecules and store it in the muscle as something that we call glycogen, okay, as glycogen. Now the actual signaling pathway that goes into this looks more like this, okay? It looks more like this. Here's your insulin receptor, okay? Some things happen on the bottom down here. We're going to activate ERS1, and you've got all of these other different kinds of things, okay? And it signals all of this different stuff, and eventually way down here at the bottom, you're going to get the signaling for these GLUT4 vesicles to go up to the cell surface, okay? Some of this insulin signaling is also involved in anabolic protein synthesis. So there's overlap between the signals that bring the glucose in and this pathway over here called the mTOR pathway, which is the thing that resistance training activates, that are gonna tell your cell to make more protein. So this is one of the reasons that when you eat carbohydrate in addition to your extra protein after resistance training, you kind of get a boost in the signal. It's because there's overlap in these things, okay? But this is what happens. It comes in, it binds, it goes to the cell surface, and voila, okay? So it's pretty simple. If you're a type 1 diabetic and you don't make insulin, then you can't move GLUT4 to the cell membrane, and you can't bring glucose in, okay? Well, that's not the whole story, okay? It's not the whole story. Insulin and insulin signaling is not the only way to drive glucose into muscle cells, okay? There is another way. There is another way, right? So if you're a type 1 diabetic, you could eat a meal and then go do something. It's pretty relatable to this class. You could go be physically active. You could go induce muscle contractions, okay? And get glucose to move out of your blood, get your muscles to take glucose up from the blood. Same thing happens if I'm a type 2 diabetic as well, okay? So there are other ways. You always have some additional glucose receptors called GLUT1 that are always in this kind of continuous low level that are on the membrane of skeletal muscle, okay? There's going to be a low level there, okay? But then we have something that is called contraction-induced or exercise-induced GLUT4 translocation, okay? So there is something about contracting skeletal muscle that activates the exact same signaling pathway that insulin does. And it will tell those GLUT4 vesicles to move to the membrane and stick GLUT4 into the membrane, and therefore you can take up glucose. This is done for a couple of reasons. One, if you're going to start exercising, the skeletal muscle, quote unquote, knows we're doing contractions, we're using up ATP, let's bring in some more substrate to make some more ATP. And so it wants to do all of that, okay? Additionally, a weird thing happens, and it seems backwards, but a weird thing happens to insulin when you exercise. No matter what your blood glucose levels are, when you begin exercising, your insulin levels fall precipitously, okay? Almost every other hormone in your body goes up during exercise. Things that want to break down glycogen, that want to break down adipose tissue, that make your heart contract more force. Like almost all of these things go up, insulin goes down, which seems backwards, right? Because you would think, oh, we need more insulin so that we can shoot some more glucose into our muscles so we've got lots of energy for when we exercise. Well, because contracting muscles activates the same pathway, we don't need to increase our insulin levels. And actually, if you were to do contractions and take some insulin, you would get too much glucose going into the muscle, and your blood glucose, you'd become hypoglycemic. Your blood glucose levels would fall too much, okay? So here is the thing. We don't fully understand how exercise, how muscle contractions activate sort of those downstream signals from the insulin receptor. People have been studying this for about 40 years, okay? And we still don't understand what it is that is going on. Once we do, though, okay, once we understand this, we can potentially cure diabetes. Someone will figure this out at some point, probably in my lifetime, knock on woods. I hope to God in y'all's lifetime. We will understand this, and they will win the Nobel Prize. It will be one of the single greatest scientific discoveries of all time. And we will, because of that, if we can figure out how we can circumvent the insulin receptor and drive glucose into your cells, then we can potentially cure diabetes. Okay. So I told you that exercise raises a lot of other hormone levels. Some of those hormone levels, as they relate to energy substrates, are called counter-regulatory hormones. These are hormones that are going to function to raise blood glucose levels rather than lower them. So insulin lowers them, but epinephrine and norepinephrine, a hormone, another pancreatic hormone called glucagon, growth hormone, and cortisol are all considered counter-regulatory hormones. These are things that are going to break down stored glucose either in your liver or in your muscles to try to raise blood glucose levels. These things tend to be very high in the morning when you haven't had a meal. So in between meals, these things will go up. And they also go up during exercise. And so there's this balance in a lot of instances between the function of insulin and these counter-regulatory hormones. And so we have to balance all of this out. The take home of all of this, though, is that exercise can be very dangerous if you're a type 1 diabetic, because they have a hard time regulating their blood glucose. They have a hard time sometimes regulating how much insulin they take. And if you have them exercise, it will pull a lot of glucose out of their blood, and so it can be very dangerous. Because exercise lowers blood glucose levels, it is a very, very, very effective treatment for type 2 diabetes, okay? It's very effective as a treatment for type 2 because you eat a meal, you have these elevated glucose levels, it drives all of that glucose into your cells, and that can be a really good thing. In addition to driving glucose into the cells, this contraction-induced GLUT4 translocation, exercise also does something else that's really, really helpful if you're a type 2 diabetic. Exercise, and I think I've got a Nope, nope, okay. Got all of these things. I don't want this. Okay. So we've talked about this. Here's our muscle contractions doing these things, okay? The other thing that exercise does is contracting your muscles functions like those drugs that make your insulin receptors more sensitive to insulin. So if you go and exercise today, okay, you go jog for 20 minutes today, the muscles that you used when you were jogging, their insulin receptors are going to be more sensitive to insulin. They're going to function better for a period of maybe 48 to 72 hours afterwards. If you are not a type 2 diabetic, this increase in insulin sensitivity is beneficial to you, but it's not really a noticeable kind of thing, okay? It's good because then anytime you eat something, you're more sensitive to insulin. Your pancreas doesn't have to work as hard, doesn't have to make as much insulin to be able to clear and get your blood glucose levels back to normal. If you're a type 2 diabetic, though, and you do not have normal insulin receptor sensitivity and function, going and exercising, and a lot of people, especially if they're mildly, they have mild decreases in insulin sensitivity, it can almost entirely fix your type 2 diabetes, okay? If you have mild decreases in insulin sensitivity, engaging in physical activity every couple of days always puts you in a state where a lot, especially if it's whole body exercise, where almost all of the insulin receptors in most of your skeletal muscle are going to get this boost in their sensitivity, and it's going to make them function much like insulin receptors in a normal person will function, okay? So the idea of insulin sensitivity is simply that I need in a normal person, 5 molecules of insulin binding to their receptors is going to move 100 molecules of glucose into my cells. As I become less sensitive to insulin, then if I have 5 molecules of insulin bound, now I'm only getting 50 molecules of glucose that move in. So I have to have 10 insulins that bind in order to get that same 100 glucose molecule movement that a normal person gets out of 5. That's the idea of sensitivity, okay? And so when you exercise, and this effect lasts for a couple of days, so if you go exercise every couple of days, you're always going to be in this state where you're getting this boost in insulin sensitivity from those contractions, okay? So the exercise is good in and of itself because it lowers your blood glucose levels. It's also good because it rescues insulin receptor function, and you get all the other benefits that are kind of associated with cardiovascular disease, which is a secondary complication of diabetes. The exercise lowers LDL cholesterol levels. The exercise lowers blood pressure, okay? The exercise may have some function on lowering weight and therefore reducing excess fat and lowering rates of obesity, okay? This is why, okay? There's another argument that type 2 diabetes is a consequence of. It's a consequence of us being sedentary and us being obese. That what happens is that being sedentary causes this decrease in insulin receptor function. And you combine that with being obese, okay, that the body has evolved, that much like our metabolic systems have evolved to be in a state of let's store food because we're very, very active and we may not get to eat every day. And so we're really good at releasing insulin. We're really good under normal circumstances of driving all of this stuff into adipose tissue and muscle to store it, okay? But we're also very used to being active. And so that being active helps keep these receptors very sensitive. And so when you aren't active, we lose all of this. So this idea that normal, proper Homo sapien genetic functioning is in a state of high levels of activity. That's one of the arguments behind. And as countries become more and more developed, as they have more and more jobs where people are sedentary as part of their jobs, right? We watch more TV, we're on our phones more, we're on our computers more. There's less physical activity, even for our kids, like at school, they have less recess, they have less PE classes, right? They play fewer and fewer sports, or they don't just go outside and run around with their friends and ride their bikes and climb trees and do whatever else that we used to do when I was little. We begin to lose what this normal function is. And that's the thing that leads to this dramatic increase in type 2 diabetes. Okay? So there's some stuff at the end of all of this where there's just some, we've got some data from some studies. Basically, if you're a type 2 diabetic and we have you exercise a bunch and we can control your diet a little bit, then we can really, really, really treat your type 2 diabetes almost exclusively with exercise. Okay. There's a couple of things at the end that Dr. Pinku talks about, but there comes some more advanced programmatic considerations that if you want to prescribe aerobic or resistance training to people that are type 1 or are type 2 diabetics, there's some things that are going to be in there. Generally, if you're a type 2 diabetic, you don't have a lot of exercise restrictions beyond something that may be going on with your cardiovascular disease. Okay, you're going to need doctor's permission, but the same kind of 3 to 5 days per week at these kind of moderate intensities, right? All of that stuff is going to be good. If you're a type 1 diabetic, it's a little bit more complicated. Exercise is good. Exercise is not contraindicated. But with a type 1 diabetic, you've just got to make sure that you are monitoring when they're taking their insulin and when they've eaten around when they're doing their exercise. Because if they've just taken some insulin, okay, because they ate something, and now you're going to have them go and exercise, then you may lower their blood glucose levels too much. So generally, for a type 1 diabetic, if they're about to have physical activity, then we just always encourage them to drink some juice or a Gatorade beforehand, or have a candy bar or something, just to be on the safe side, that you're going to have plenty of glucose that can then get driven into your muscles. And you're lessening your chance of becoming hypoglycemic. Okay, we've got those things. It's pretty much all going to, be there. Okay, this stuff is pretty straightforward, and that, I think, is pretty much everything that we've got from this. And I'm not going to ask you guys really very many questions about all of these kind of special considerations. Okay, boom, boom, this kind of stuff at the end. You're not responsible for these things. Dr. Pinku has done a bunch of research on this, and so he likes to show a little bit more of that in his class. I'm just checking through here to make sure. The take-home message is all pretty good. This is pretty much it. Okay. All right. So I know I blew right through our normal kind of stopping time, but I figured you guys wouldn't care too much if we could get finished early. All right. So I'm going to